First, the First Amendment lays out 5 basic freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the freedom to petition the government. These rights were important to establish because they ensured that individuals could think, speak, and act without fear of being punished for disagreeing with the government. People commonly mistake this for meaning that they can say anything they want and never face any repercussions. For example, if someone posts something on the internet and they get fired from their job because of, that's not a violation of free speech. Free speech only applies to people speaking out against the government. It does not mean that a company, for instance, cannot punish an employee if that employee speaks against the company. 2. The Second Amendment supports the right to own firearms. Though it's been hotly debated whether the Constitution's framers only had in mind the malicious use of guns, or if any citizen had a constitutional right to a firearm, this confusion is largely due to the 4 commas in the amendment that are grammatically confusing. This amendment is very controversial in today's time due to the growing amount of gun violence. 3. The Third Amendment prohibits the government from forcing citizens to give lodging to soldiers in their homes without permission. Before the Revolutionary War, Americans were required to give food and lodging to British soldiers as part of the 1765 Quartering Act. This amendment really doesn't get used today, as this was more a problem that they were having during the Revolution. 4. The Fourth Amendment prevents the government or police from searching or seizing the homes, belongings, or bodies of citizens without probable cause or a warrant. 5. The Fifth Amendment gives people accused of crimes a variety of rights and protections, including the right to a grand jury indictment for felony offenses in federal court, the restriction on double jeopardy, being put on trial for the same crime after being found not guilty, protection against forced self-incrimination, the guarantee of due process of law, and the prevention of the government taking private property for public use without proper compensation. 6. The Sixth Amendment guarantees people accused of a crime receive fair and accurate criminal proceedings, including the right to a speedy, public trial by jury from the area where the crime was committed, the right to confront and question witnesses against the accused, the right to subpoena witnesses and have them testify at trial, and the right to a lawyer. This amendment is also kind of ironic because the quote, "a quick and speedy trial," could mean months or even years in the modern day. 7. The Seventh Amendment promises the right to a jury trial for civil cases that involve property worth more than $20. Even though criminal cases that go to trial always have juries, civil cases rarely do. 8. The Eighth Amendment prevents the federal government from imposing excessive bail and inflicting cruel or unusual punishment on criminal defendants. Some people believe that the death penalty is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. 9. The Ninth Amendment essentially just clarifies that even though the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights names certain rights, that doesn't mean that people don't have other rights not specifically included in the U.S. Constitution. 10. The Tenth Amendment leaves any powers not specifically assigned to the federal government to each state or to the people. This amendment protects against the possibility of the national government assuming powers that have not already been assigned to it, and is greatly important to keep the federal government limited as the U.S. Constitution framers intended. 11. The 11th Amendment prevents federal courts from hearing lawsuits against states, which changes part of Article 3, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. It was passed by Congress on March 4, 1794. And ratified on February 7, 1795. 12. The 12th Amendment, which was passed by Congress on December 9, 1803, and ratified on June 15, 1804, changed the presidential election process as laid out in Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and fixed several problems that came up because of the development of political parties and how that affected the Electoral College. The 12th Amendment was passed in response to a tie vote in the 1800 election between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. However, the 20th Amendment, ratified in 1933, changed the dates of presidential terms and congressional sessions. 13. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress on January 31, 1865, and ratified on December 6, 1865, abolished slavery and superseded a part of Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which set out that fugitive slaves be returned to their owners. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on January 1, 1863, only freed slaves from the Confederate States that had seceded. The 13th Amendment was able to free all slaves and indentured servants throughout the country. It did not, however, grant black Americans the right to vote. 14. The 14th Amendment has 5 sections that include defining citizenship rights, apportionment of representatives, denying public office to those who have participated in insurrection, invalidating Confederate debt, and giving Congress the power to enforce the amendment. Section 1 is one of the most important parts of this amendment because it grants former slaves citizenship in the United States and guarantees former slaves equal protection and due process. 15. The 15th Amendment, which was passed by Congress on February 26, 1869, and ratified on February 3, 1870, guarantees the right to vote and guarantees that right cannot be denied based on race. Despite this amendment, discriminatory practices continued in voting booths, including literacy tests and poll taxes, to prevent black Americans from voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Voter suppression remains an issue to this day. 16. The 16th Amendment was passed by Congress on July 2, 1909, and ratified on February 3, 1913. It gives Congress the power to collect income tax, which changes a part of Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. This amendment reversed the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 1895, Supreme Court decision that made a national income tax almost impossible. 17. The 17th Amendment, which was passed by Congress on May 13, 1912, and ratified on April 8, 1913, made it so that U.S. senators would be voted into office by direct elections instead of by state legislatures, as set out in Article 1, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. This is one of the only substantial changes made to the structure of Congress since it was laid out in the original U.S. Constitution. 18. The 18th Amendment enacted the prohibition of manufacturing and selling alcohol, beginning 1 year after the ratification of the amendment. It was passed by Congress on December 18, 1917, and ratified on January 16, 1919. Prohibition was in effect for 13 years before it was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, which we'll get to in a minute. 19. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Before the 19th Amendment existed, it was passed by Congress on June 4, 1919, and ratified on August 18, 1920, Susan B. Anthony argued that the 14th Amendment Privileges and Immunities Clause gave women the right to vote since they had been citizens all along. In Minor v. Happersett, 1875, the Supreme Court decided that being citizens alone did not give women the right to vote, so the women's suffrage movement worked to get a U.S. constitutional amendment passed to give women the right to vote. Today, women make a major difference in elections and are running for office themselves. There is still a ways to go for equal representation. Women make up 24% of Congress, 27% of state legislators, 18% of governors, and 22% of mayors, according to Ignite. 20. The 20th Amendment set the beginning and end of presidential terms and congressional sessions. It also lays out the order of presidential succession, but that order was later altered by the 25th Amendment. 21. The The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. It was passed by Congress on February 20, 1933, and ratified on December 5, 1933. This is the only amendment that repeals a previous amendment, and it is the only amendment that was ratified by the state ratifying conventions as opposed to the legislatures of the states. 22. The 22nd Amendment, which was passed by Congress on March 21, 1947, and ratified on February 27, 1951, limits presidential terms to 2. This is mostly because George Washington decided to retire after just 2 terms, which set the precedent for the next 150 years of presidents in the United States. The 22nd Amendment was passed out of fear of a tyrannical president. Prior to the passage of this amendment, Franklin D. Roosevelt had been elected to 4 terms as president, serving from 1933 until his death in 1945. 23. The 23rd Amendment was passed by Congress June 16, 1960, and ratified on March 29, 1961. It allowed the citizens of Washington, D.C., to choose electors for presidential elections because, as citizens of a federal district and not a state, D.C. residents are not citizens of a state. Before this amendment was ratified, D.C. residents were denied the right to vote for federal public officials. Today, D.C. residents are still unrepresented in Congress, but they have a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. 24. The 24th Amendment was passed by Congress on August 27, 1962, and ratified on January 23, 1964. It abolished poll taxes, which had previously been required to vote in elections. When the U.S. Constitution was first ratified, most states allowed only property owners to vote, but as time went on, many states moved to poll taxes. At first, that expanded the right to vote because more citizens could pay the poll tax than prove they were property owners. However, poll taxes were brought back as a way to prevent black Americans from voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 25. The 25th Amendment, which was passed by Congress on July 6, 1965, and ratified on February 10, 1967, sets the order of succession for the president and lays out what to do in the case of presidential incapacity. This amendment has only been used 3 times since it was ratified, to relieve presidents from their duties because of physical health. It was initially passed out of fear of presidential succession after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. The first use of the 25th Amendment was in 1974 when Gerald R. Ford became president after Richard Nixon's resignation. The second use was in 1985 when Ronald Reagan temporarily handed his presidential powers to Vice President George H. W. Bush during a surgery. George W. Bush invoked the 25th Amendment twice during his presidency to give Vice President Dick Cheney presidential powers, while he had routine colonoscopies in 2002 and in 2007. 26. The 26th Amendment allowed 18-year-old U.S. citizens to vote and modified Amendment 14, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. This is the last amendment that deals with voting rights protections. Before the 26th Amendment was ratified, Americans voted at age 21. However, during the Vietnam War, men were being drafted from the age of 18 and yet they didn't have the right to vote. So Congress passed the Voting Rights Act that lowered the voting age for all elections at the federal, state and local level to 18. It was passed by Congress on March 23, 1971, and ratified on July 1, 1971. The Supreme Court held in Oregon vs. Mitchell, 1970, that Congress couldn't require state and local governments to lower the voting age, so the 26th Amendment was ratified in order to do that. 27. The 27th Amendment, also known as the Congressional Compensation Act of 1789, was the second amendment that James Madison proposed when he brought forward his draft of 12 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. It says that pay raises or decreases for members of Congress can only take effect after the next election. When it was originally proposed in 1789, only 6 states voted for it to be ratified, including Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia. For 80 years, the proposal was untouched, but Ohio ratified it in 1873 and Wyoming ratified it in 1978. In 1982, a movement to ratify the amendment was started by an undergraduate student to prevent corruption in Congress. By the 90s, the necessary 38 states had ratified the amendment, almost 203 years after it was proposed. It was ratified on May 7, 1992.